Um, Good evening. This lecture is about accountability and participation in human service organizations. Last week, we talked about the various aspects of market reform in human services, the introduction of neoclassical economic principles into funding that has come about. And we also talked about the crisis of public confidence, the privatization of human service organizations, some aspects of deprofessionalization, which includes dwindling employment opportunities for more professionally qualified people compared to workers within the sector with lesser qualifications, a comparative decline in professional occupational options that are otherwise present to people. And we also probably took up the challenge to explain the limited capacity of social work professionals themselves articulating their value and how they carry on their activities and how do they present themselves in a rather competitive world in which most of the social services are in a way involved. We also talked about the equal ability in a way for the the market reforms that are coming around and the labor market in which we seem to be not we don't seem to be able to carry ourselves with the distinctive capacity that we otherwise possess and talk about. Certainly there were issues around whether we need to reorient ourselves, whether we need to talk to more reformed, more sophisticated articulation as to what social work is all about. So I thought the way in which the social work itself was constructed with the values and ethics of social work that we have, the knowledge of organizational environment in which we are, the role on activities of social work that we do, and the professional identity. Some of those questions were also very, very important in the construction of social work. So we did say that I think Healy talked about human service organizations increasingly facing demands for service quality, responsiveness in an economic climate where the financial constraints are generally hitting us quite straightforward. So there's no other go other than getting hit by some of those financial constraints. So now let us look at accountability and participation in that context and what it would actually mean. And in this particular lecture, we will be concentrating on some aspects only because not really going into accounting management, but accountability as such in a larger context. That's what we will be looking at. And when we look at the larger context of accountability, again, it goes back to some of our very initial lectures about what shapes social services, what happens with the way in which we expect these services to be handed over to the communities, and how do we, in a way, expect further challenges from the community when communities increase their demands, and what happens, how do we fund those demands. So human service organizations in the present day receive a large proportion of their funding from the government. That's very clear to us. And as a result, there are expectations. They must certainly be accountable and responsible to those who provide them. And who provides them? It's the government. So, which naturally means quality standards come from the government. the kind of reporting standards come from the government, and the kind of efficiencies and the efficacies with which we will have to carry on these activities also are kind of dictated by the government. So it's very, very important for us to understand the context of efficiency and the context of accountabilities and responsibilities that come with these things. So there are multiple forms of accountability. There is something called an upward accountability. The upward accountability is all about how the government, in a way, expects us to look at. Upward accountability is more or less about the government's way of looking at how the human service organizations are, which receive the funding, are also accountable to the executive or the parliament in the country. Then we have what is also called the inward accountability. Inward accountability is about internally driven evaluations, the audits that are conducted, the peer reviews that take place within the organization, the expectations, what you write, your case reports, your team reports, and everything else is is also one of those accountabilities that we need to understand. Then there is something also called the outward accountability. Outward accountability is to the public, to the media, to the newspapers, to the television. And that is because someone or the other, if he is either disgruntled or not happy with the service, something has happened somewhere. Within the organization, also, there are people who can talk about it, not just murmur, but might even want to take it out outside. So, as a result of such things, you would be expecting people to think about whistleblowing. So, it's a whistleblowing concept that comes out. Then you have also what is known as downwards accountability. Downwards accountability is basically to the client and the consumer. You believe you are accountable to the client and consumer because he's the one for whom you are basically you are a service provider too. Similarly, politicians and policymakers in Australia and many other countries also believe that spending on human services is essentially, some people do believe even now, is a drain in the economy and should be restrained or reduced. Now, you can't get out of these kind of statements because people do make these statements. I mean, they made these statements in COVID 19 about spending billions of dollars on aged care. And of course, in Australia, we have very, very quickly started addressing aged care reform. But otherwise, yeah, around the world, I think economic criteria became a very, very important and paramount issue in all of these things. So let us look at how the slide looks like. So you got an upward mobility, accountability, inward accountability, outward accountability, and downward accountability. So it's got the government and executive, the parliament, the internally driven evaluations, the peer reviews to the public, media, and also to the client and consumer. So that's what it is kind of, uh, talks about. So the demands in the human service organizations are increasing as a result of major structural changes in social institutions. And what are those social institutions? How is it that politicians and policymakers in Australia and in many other countries think that human services are, in a way, kind of a drain on the people themselves? Now, what are those? Some people think the social institutions are basically the labor market. What does the labor market do? It provides us the opportunity of um, working or providing labor, and in turn getting some wages for ourselves, and then of course meet the needs of our own family. The next one, as an institution, the family itself is changing as an institution. And demographic shifts, moving from city to the rural area, from rural area to the city, younger people coming away from rural towns to the cities makes a big difference. There isn't anybody else to work on agriculture in rural areas when something like that happens. So you will find the shifts in population from one place to the other, shifts in population from one country to the other also obviously make the changes which are which definitely affect the organizations that you're talking about, human service organizations. Then there is increased social dependency. What happens is when there are no wages, when there are labor economy is affected, the labor market is affected, not many people are taking services, then automatically you lose on your jobs. When you lose on your jobs, your dependency or social dependency increases. Where does that social dependency take people to? Takes us in Australian context to Centrelink. It takes other people in other countries into their so-called social security. Now what happens to third world countries where no such social securities exist? So you would be expecting a higher rate of unemployment in those countries. You would be expecting people to do any kind of job for a much lesser wage in those countries. Continuing urbanization. The more and more cities become, the more and more city spaces, urbanization, industrialization takes place, what happens? Then the rural areas get diminished. Agriculture as an occupation might even get diminished. Animal husbandry and farming industries get obviously threatened. As a result, it is possible that few people will be involved in much more larger production than more people being involved in farming. In other words, there will be a few people who will be able to dictate more terms about the farm produce than more people being involved and therefore able to support themselves and able to support people to acquire the produce. So that's one of those things that we need to understand. Changing technologies. Changing technologies would mean um, in a country, I mean, you look at it from your own internet, from your mobile phones. A few years ago, we used to carry a big one, and slowly it has become slimmer and slimmer. From and it is able to do many things. As a result, people cannot move without the mobile phone. Not only that, it's a banking instrument. It's everything, and therefore it has also become an issue of cybersecurity or cyber insecurity. So there are things which come with it. There are things which come with it. In other words, what are those things that are coming with it? Problems also come with it. There are advantages, there are disadvantages. You got to be a little more careful. We got to when anywhere, suppose you go into, in any place that you go into where you find a lottery ticket or something is being given, a prize money is to be given, and you go in and your ticket at the end of the day they ask you, put your ticket into the raffle, we're going to give you a card today. You're tempted by it. 1,000 people will give away their name, their telephone number, maybe even they might even ask you for your bank account details. God knows what they would do. But that's the kind of situation into which you are being asked to give in and give in and give in. It's not only technological, it is becoming kind of mandatory. People tell you, we take these medical details of yours and, of course, a few details that come with it, and we will not give this away to anybody else other than those who are possibly dealing with us for services which will be essential, we think. Okay. So there's a big thinking out there. So someone or the other tries to probably take our data and give it away. So there are issues around various technologies too. Now, there is rising political consciousness among disadvantaged minorities. Now, who are these minorities? Marginalized people, socioeconomically low strata of people, young people, unemployed people, people with disabilities, people with mental health issues, people, women, children, indigenous populations. and those who, from time to time, may not necessarily have a proper employment. This is not the story of one country, this is the story of many, many countries. So, what happens to them? There is some consciousness emerging from them. Hey, we need to be looked after, we need to be cared for. But then again, what happens? In countries when there are no resources, nobody would bother about them. In countries where there are resources, people will bother about them and say, we will limit you for certain things. We won't give you emergency assistance for a long time. We will ask you to do something else. Dole for Work program, what was that all about? Didn't allow people to simply take the dole, but expected people to come up and work, which I think for many people, it looked like a fair compensation for what was being otherwise given to them. So, in the context of human service organizations probably are being asked to become more and more efficient, more and more efficient, and to show how that efficiency can cut money, can cut budgets, can organize can organize with speed, can be given to more people. So it's quantity and quality. Quality cannot be sacrificed. Quantity can must be increased. That is the goal of the so-called efficiency. So in other words, they expect us to do more with less. And that seems to be the goal of most of our accountability management issues. Right. Okay, that diagram over there is what probably I was trying to tell you. In the center are those demands. Increasing social dependency, the labor market, the family changes, the demographic shifts, continuing urbanization, changing technologies, rise in the consciousness amongst marginalized people, and of course, rising service expectations from the context of quality as well as quantity. So that's a bit of a revision slide from what I've just spoken before, and that should probably explain most of the stuff that we've got there. Now, the the context here, the administrative cost efficiency. What does that mean? In the context in the earlier lecture, we also talked about managerialism as an ideology that has come about. With the managerial ideology that has come about, it looks to me that, yeah, I think that's placed there better. Okay. With the managerial ideology that we have been talking about, there are about three efficiencies that we address. One is called the administrative, which is about the cost efficiency. How much does it cost to provide this service to wherever it is? For instance, rural areas. If it is a service from in mental health, everything has probably, if it has to be only done through the Royal Brisbane Hospital or somewhere or the other, it'll cost more. So what do? We regionalize those services, maybe from Toowoomba, maybe from Rockhampton, maybe from Mackay. Why do we do that? We do that from efficiency's sake. Then again, even though we do have services there, if we were talking in terms of taking them to further remote, from Roma into Talon, into Charleville, somewhere or the other, if we were to look at services to be provided like that, Emerald, then what are we talking about? Then that means it costs more to provide service to a more remote rural location. So efficiency wise, there's a ratio of cost to the units output of the organization. The organization needs to ensure that there is an applied equitably across services. What it means is that whatever the costs are, look, it should basically be cross-managed. In other words, yes, it costs a lot less in the city because more people are around. It costs a lot more in the rural area because less people are around. So we divide the costs. So in other words, sometimes the city probably would pay for um, yeah, from for the rural areas because it costs less, more people are concentrated here. So the services are obviously there is a bit of a service adjustment that can be done in such a way that it costs more to provide there. So fair enough, and that's reasonable because there are less people asking for services there, or maybe there are more people, but there are not many services. So that's the way you need to understand. Then there is a cost of economic inefficiency. Now, this is about the impact of a service on the overall economy. So to run the service, which means when we talk about mental health services do not take into consideration only a rural service vis-a-vis the urban service. They obviously take into consideration overarching goal of mental health services in the entire Queensland, or for that matter in the country, depending upon what budgets are we looking at. Target efficiency. That's another term that we use. Target efficiency is about the extent to which human services are directed to those groups for which they are intended. I want to reach children. And if I'm not able to reach children, but I'm always reaching parents, then you need to define that it's not just the parents, we are including the family in which children are there and they are part and parcel of it. So if families are taken care of, parents are taken care of, children are taken care of. It's a definitions which come to rescue you in terms of what you are trying to say. So you need to understand that um, efficiency is basically a legitimate goal, and workers must use the concept to define and improve the services, and that's exactly what we are talking about now. In relation to the same, we also have terminologies such as there are there are terminologies which we use called effectiveness. Let me just get that slide up. Okay, right. With the effectiveness, efficiency, effectiveness, you get that. Efficiency is related to cost and administrative costs and how you travel that particular service and how do you speed up. But effectiveness is about really effective where? Effective with the clients, effective in the timeliness. So there are different concepts that uh, work on this. So there are several reasons for human service organizations and for social workers within these organizations to think about effectiveness in their work. Why do you need to be effective? You need to be effective because if you're not effective, there's no other reason. I mean, effectiveness is a reason by itself, right? Because your impact of your service is measured by effectiveness. You got to be useful. Common sense term. It is inherent in the politics of human service organizations that all organizations are being assessed in the current task environment. And what is the task environment? To be efficient administratively, to be cost efficient, many things that we talked about. So assessments of effectiveness determine the flow of resources and legitimation of the organization. Okay, so if you are effective and you're doing well, then all right, we recognize you and give you the money that you need to continue your work. So effective organizations are well positioned to attract resources and responsibilities. Okay, so it basically means that there's no other way, there's no escape for us to move out of the effectiveness and efficiency kind of a circus that we've got. If effectiveness is questioned, resources, legitimacy, and relations within the organization are threatened. Concern with effectiveness is an ethical responsibility as well as a political necessity. We'll expand on that. Now let's go back to this. If effectiveness is questioned, resources, legitimacy, and relationships within the organization are threatened very clearly because not effective, people won't come. Not effective, then the service ideal is questioned. The goal is questioned. Not effective, the organization will close down. So that's what it means. And so therefore, further on, it is also an ethical responsibility right from the beginning when you set up an organization that it is effective. So what does effectiveness carry? And what are the kind of meanings that effectiveness carries? Let me look them up, some of the meanings. I'll probably open the slide and look it up along with you. Right. Effectiveness from the scientific management approach, effectiveness is seen as the achievement of stated objectives. That's what we said. You need to have a goal and you need to say what the goal is all about. The criteria for success is not always clear in human services work, which may be related to the resources made available to the service, which is just a qualifying, very clearly it qualifies that you need the resources. Quality of work will depend on the resources. Quality of work will also depend on the worker. Characteristics of the consumers or a degree of support received from the task environment will decide the effectiveness. Who decides the effectiveness? Consumer satisfaction decides the effectiveness. How does effectiveness get evaluated? Well, I used the word already evaluated. Well, effectiveness gets tested, screened, examined by some methodology, and the methodologies are always evaluative. And what are those methodologies? It could be by yourself as an organizer. As a social worker, you want to know how effective you are. You might canvass a few questions. Your manager might canvass a few questions with your permission, or your manager might even canvass questions without your permission. It's okay. Anything is possible because at the end of the day, somebody is paying you for your service. You're being evaluated. So you should always be alert in terms of what you've done, what you could do, what you could have done before or after. Whatever it is, you need to be accountable. So effectiveness as per systems theory is equated with organizational survival and growth. Beautifully said. That means no organization can grow unless people are effective. It's important, however, not to confuse organizational success with organizational effectiveness. Now, how do we explain success being different from effectiveness? An organization might have many activities. Okay, yours is one of those activities. So your activity is being assessed. An organization's activity in general is not being assessed. There could be a few other activities which are going on quite well. It's one of those activities which is not going well. So that's therefore there's a little bit of difference between organizational success and that organizational intervention that we are looking at, which is effective or not. Organizations can be highly successful, but not necessarily produce good outcomes for clients. Some people say, in most of those welfare organizations, they say, yeah, they're great. But, somehow We are not very satisfied. Why we are not satisfied? Because too many procedures, too many paperwork, too much of rigmarole, too much of hassle getting those services. So that could be one of the ways by which people can give you such a feedback. Right. This is about effectiveness being linked to workers, commitment to the value and importance of their work, and the need for ongoing analysis of what they do. I think I've said that many times very clearly. We are about our work, we are about what we do. Does what I am doing really make a difference? Does my program really work? In your case study, final one, I wonder if those workers actually ask those kind of questions to themselves. Maybe they didn't. So therefore, somebody is asking them the questions. Maybe that is the reason why the CEO was appointed and all of those kind of stuff has taken place. Let's see what else is there. Now it's almost coming to the end of that. The concept of effectiveness as a concept is essentially political in nature, reflecting the values and interests of those undertaking the assessment. Well said. Political in the sense from an evaluative context. It is not from a labor perspective or a neoliberal perspective or a liberal government perspective. It's a question of the values and interests of undertaking at that point of time. An assessment is open to the values prevailing with that particular program decision by the political, by the government in place. And therefore, it is political. It is open to interpretations, and workers should take assessment of effectiveness seriously because of their own ethical and political responsibility. Is every worker right away responsible for the government? One might take that very, very seriously. Even if you are a grassroots worker in the government, you are responsible for everything right to the top. When they say heads roll when something goes wrong, it's not just the CEO who goes, it goes right up to the down. A few people will go with that. So basically, that's when, especially in Queensland, we try to, especially in government, they always use a word called, oh, we courier mail test. That means if it comes in newspaper, that means it's shabby, shouldn't come up, shouldn't become a scandal, should try to do something really good. Okay. Johnson May, again, one of those old books, which talks about excellence. Excellence is another criteria with which workers can assess their work and that of their organization. Managers and workers in human service organizations should be strongly committed to their to high quality consumer service and strive for this to be central to the ethos and culture of human services. Now, there are, in relation to the same, if we are talking about excellence, while we agree this is what excellence is all about, um, there's also another way of looking at the meaningful nature of our own work. What does it emphasize when we say meaningful nature of our own work? It talks about the high quality of services to consumers and how we respond to the consumers. Their new, if there are new needs, how do we respond? If we are settling the old needs, how do we respond? So managers and workers in human service organizations should be strongly committed to high quality consumer satisfaction. and quality. Now, what is that quality? Quality is about accessibility, quality is about timeliness, quality is about consistency, quality is about humaneness, how close you are with your heart in terms of servicing. And of course, at the same time, technical proficiency, or what we would call the 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 way in which you work through your craft or act. You know, a physiotherapist would probably stick to physiotherapy. She might make a few case management decisions, but she may not enter into a social services issues. She might collect a few data, but she'll give it to you and say, look, in passing, I understood the family is suffering from a few things. And I have a funny feeling that, I was talking to Carter and, talking to Rachel, and I think I have a feeling that they do have a few issues, few tickling issues. Okay. So that's something about domestic violence or something that your physiotherapist in her assessment brought it to your notice. But she's humble enough to tell you, look, I have a feeling you need to probe a little further. So that's about our so-called technical proficiencies area. So you shut up in an area where you're not supposed to be entering, and somebody else opens up in that area where he or she can basically move on. So when we apply some of these principles, how does our effectiveness and excellence look like? I think from one perspective, the efficiency, applying some of those elements of excellence means we got to be seen punctually in places where we work. We got to be consulted, and we need to be, even we need to be consulted and listened to. That's exactly what maybe in the workers in Avalon Care were talking about, were Belinda and all those staff. Were they all consulted? Well, were they informed of their rights and responsibilities and entitlements? That's an issue too. Were they given full and accurate information about certain things? See, like what, not only about the community but about themselves. And people also, consumers, are they assured of their confidentiality? Are they treated with dignity and respect? And do they also have a range of grievance procedures? Communities must have, workers must have, all of them must have. So human service organizations must basically be encouraged to develop service standards, quality standards across various issues, right from frontline workers to team leaders to consumers. So, assessing excellence involves largely value judgments by you, by me, by everybody else. So, when we are making value judgments, it's also imperative that we space these value judgments on accepted values in our society. And, the humaneness that we talked about. So I think that's one of the most important issues. And let's see the next slide. Okay. So applying these elements means, as I said, consumers should be seen punctually, be consulted, listened to, be informed of their rights and responsibilities and entitlements, be given full and accurate information, be assured of confidentiality, be treated with dignity and respect, and have available a range of grievance procedures. But again, the same thing can also be asked about how well some of our own, the organizations themselves gave these things internally to the staff as well. So it's a different issue altogether, but some of these things are valid. So human service organizations should be encouraged to develop quality standards for sure, and build up their reputation. assess the level of availability of resources every now and then, and have the commitment of their workers and ensure the accountability procedures are as transparently as possible uh, made are made are followed in an organization. I hope that gives you a reasonable amount of understanding as to where where we go in terms of um, human service organizations and what happens within them. I'll just stop the sharing at this point of time and hopefully also stop the recording and post this away to you. Thank